Now that the sandbox is settled for a month, do glaives have a place in it? Some people thought they would be better because there's more melee scalars now affecting them, while others thought they would be worse, as these scalars are moved from multiplicative to additive. The actual result is less simple. In some places they're better, in others worse, though I will say the good does outweigh the bad. The background gameplay is the final conquest mission at -40 power, supposed to be very difficult content, but Winterbite, Worm Gods and the W key still make it look easy. Which leads me into my first point: how do you build into a glaive now? And you do really want to build into them, by the way. If you do just equip a glaive, they will be worse than last season because of their base nerfs to variant combatant tiers at these values. An example build which I am running here is the following. Wormgod Caress, as this Titan exotic now gives up to a 400% melee damage increase to all sources. The knockout aspect gives a 160% melee damage increase to all sources, this now including glaives. Winterbite itself also deals more damage, 50% against lower enemy tiers and 20% against bosses, just so long as it has ammo in the mag. Shield Crush and Artifact trait also gives a 50% melee damage boost as long as you have Frost Armour or Woven Mail. There's also the 200 melee stat now. This one is a bit different as it is still a multiplier, and goes on top of all previous options at a maximum of a 1.4 times. There's a lot of freezing, and frozen targets take 120% increased melee damage. This can be done by Winterbite, build aspects and even some artifact mods. So altogether, the maximum damage stacking with this setup becomes the following. With 200 melee stat, this is a 924% damage increase, and if it's against a frozen target, it's over 2000% damage increase, which is pretty crazy. This build last season would look different, because knockout and the melee stat would do nothing, and the values on Wormgod is instead a 200% multiplicative increase. So this comes to about a 450%, though no bell was also a thing, and this is another multiplier. Putting this on top of the existing options, it would come to 810%. And while the 810% is a little bit lower, remember that glaives now are dealing less base damage. So the previous season's maximum is higher than the current season's maximum, however that is clutching quite a bit on Artifact mod. The one we have now, Shield Crush, is a lot less effective. Though it's all a bit give and take, and this is just one example. And it's also fair to say more people would use something like Synthoceps or its spirit version over Wormgods, as they are just easier to use. Not to mention all the other potential boosts glaives now have access to. There's things like Combination Blow, Banner of War, Offensive Bulwark, and I'll put these options and their additive values on screen now. These are all making glaives more flexible to build into, sometimes not even requiring a melee boosting exotic, which previously this wasn't really an option. And those melee boosting exotics have also had their values changed across the board. Winners include Winter's Guile, now capping at 400%, and Triton Vice now at 200%, outclassing Synthoceps. There's also been a bunch of additions or changes which coincidentally affect glaives. The biggest one of these has to be the TechSec Armour set effect. This is genuinely better than any damage boost you could ask for, and is an absolute complete game changer. Since glaive melee is kinetic, all of its bonuses apply to any glaive melee hit. The two-part set effect is a casual 200% damage increase against all shielded enemies, including overshields. This actually gets better as the game becomes more difficult, as you start getting regular enemies such as harpies getting overshields. But the much better effect is the 4-piece bonus. It reads that on defeating an elite enemy, or breaking any shield, a kinetic shockwave is triggered, which disorientates nearby enemies. By the way, this elite enemy definition is actually very loose. Basically, as long as it's not a red bar, it should count. And on each activation, all enemies nearby are blinded, and you get what is essentially one part of a kinetic tremor proc. So it's free damage, and enemies which don't fight back triggered very often. Glaive builds being naturally aggressive, this is a way of damage mitigation, which doesn't even rely on Guardian side damage resist. Just simply enemies won't be hitting you back. Also for survivability, you know how I said knockouts give glaive damage now? The other part of Knockout is also active, healing on melee final blows. This is basically Devour for Glaives. For me, this alongside everything else on the subclass makes Prismatic Titan the go-to for Glaives. Especially if using Winterbite or Rake Angle, you can also run Diamond Lance for a lot of free sources, which of course hugely increase melee damage. And while not always true, most of the time it kind of works out like this. Additive buffs are better if you only have a few of them, while multiplicative buffs take over if you're stacking a lot of different options. Like this for example. Banner of War was a 1.1 times multiplier before, now it's a 100% damage increase. So if a glaive hit 120 in PvP, a 1.1x on that will bring it to 132, nothing really of note here. But if a glaive hit 120 in PvP and is increased by 100%, it's now 240. This might matter. It turns out it matters a lot, maybe too much, and honestly it's probably best not to tell people about this. To summarise, glaives are better in roaming content if built into, and building into them is easier than before. Alongside that, there's whole new options like TechSec, which can make your build all the better. The exotic glaives are still great. I like Winterbite and Wormgods as they are both featured. Annoyingly, the only featured glaive to be honest, as there is no new ones released at this point. But as long as Avant-Garde isn't active, you can just use whichever one you want pretty successfully. Excalibur, for example, is great at maintaining Shield Crush. Legendary glaives can still put in work, but are limited in what perks you want. It's still close to melee's very good, now giving a 60% additive damage increase, but every other perk is just to take it or leave it. Even in Mythic, you can use a glaive to roam, and it will be much quicker than any other option once you get the buffs rolling. The other side is boss damage. Last season the strat for this was Winterbite, typically Wormgods or Synthoceps, and the artifact perk Nobel, using a 3-hit combo blocking between them to reset the cooldown. Trying this setup, but obviously without Nobel due to its non-existence against refill, it's quite notably worse. Of course artifact support is partially to blame here, but Glaives did also take that big damage decrease against bosses, and Winterbite specifically had its exotic trait bonus changed from a multiplicative 50% to an additive 20% against bosses. Which, in my opinion, is very harsh, but you can see the results. It's not like it's really terrible or anything. 3 phases to solo a dungeon boss, I mean it's quite an easy dungeon boss it must be said, is still respectable, though last season it was a comfortable 2 phase. Overall Glaives are for sure worse against boss targets, but if there are juiced artifacts options in the future, this could still change. However, their intended use for roam is still very much viable and recommended heavily. It's honestly quite a bit better. Not to mention that whole sinister PvP thing. Thank you for watching.